the topic for today, as some of you guys may know from the email that got sent out, is how do we build creative confidence to design accessible product? And that's exactly what I want to capture today. And when I talk about the terms creative confidence, I'm going to get to that in a little bit later to kind of explain what that means to me. So just a brief intro, my name is Julie Doe. I'm currently the design lead at Scotiabank Digital Factory. I lead the mobile stream where we're looking at reinventing the new Scotia mobile banking app. So what does that mean for us? The really great part about what we do is we get to build accessibility design from the ground up of our project. And so I'm here today to kind of walk you guys through my learnings in my process and how I kind of have taken that and adapted it into my day-to-day work here at Scotiabank. And I think it's super, super important for me to say that I am not an accessibility expert by any means at all, but I am very passionate about what I do day-to-day, including accessibility into all of my designs. And also one thing to note is that I do design in the mobile platform space, so a lot of my presentation is geared towards that, but that's not to say that these principles can't be applied for any of you guys, any of you designers who do design for the web or other various platforms. So how did I start with accessibility? When I joined Digital Factory, I was actually hired on as a visual designer, so that was my initial background, but I then got asked to design an accessible and inclusive mobile banking app for 2 million people, over 2 million people. So for someone who doesn't know at that point what accessibility or inclusive design truly meant, it was truly scary. So, and I think a lot of that starts with understanding what accessibility is and why are we designing for it. So being a designer on a team and leading a product where I don't know what accessibility is, it was critical for me to learn about it. And that first question for me was like, well, why do I have to do this beyond what is accessibility? For me, a lot of accessibility starts with building your mentality. I think a lot of us, you know, we hear about this quite often in a lot of the different conferences or even online, that accessibility, it should not be an afterthought in what we design for. It is not the most productive and the most effective way to design for accessibility. We truly need to think about it from the bottom up and the foundation of any of our products. So that means that we need to think about how we can shift that mentality of building for people with accessible needs to designing for all types of users, regardless of someone's ability, context, or situation. And it's really thinking about someone's ability when they navigate through any specific experience or product. So I've actually broken it down into 3 different kind of categories. And I kind of, for myself, see this as being more inclusive than just being accessible. So what we often consider is designing for users who have a range of accessible needs. And there's such a spectrum when it comes to this. So for example, someone who has blindness, someone can be permanently blind, but someone can just have pink eye and maybe their contacts are dry and they can't see as clearly for a day. So there's quite a spectrum that we kind of need to consider. So someone who may have hearing impairment issues or mobility issues, and those are people who have more day-to-day accessible needs. And again, there's such a spectrum to that we need to think about. And that middle column is what we often mistaken accessibility to be, is to design for users who specifically use assistive technologies and features. And it's definitely something that we need to consider. So those are our users who actually use native functionalities such as Voiceover, display zoom, people who adjust their brightness and contrast, and that could be any of us really, people who use assistive touch or audio adjustment within their experiences. Give me a second as we're trying to. Sorry guys, small technical thing we're trying to figure out. Oh, perfect, we figured it out, okay. I gotta go back to slides. Okay, we're right on track. Okay, so if we kind of look at the third column there, for me, this is the most important. And it's not designing just for people who use assistive technologies, but it's designing for the day-to-day user who faces situational circumstances. And as designers, this is something we probably often don't think about more day-to-day, but something that's crucial. So think about a user who has sun glare on their phone, someone who is currently in a dark environment or in a very loud environment. Or even thinking about when a user doesn't have strong internet access, how do they use your product? Or someone whose native language isn't English, how do they perceive and use our various experiences? So kind of thinking about the more broader spectrum of users versus people who just use something like assistive technologies is kind of the mindset that I'm trying to get us to kind of shift and change to. So I'm sure many of us have seen this, and I've actually taken this directly from Microsoft, and it's their diagram that kind of shows the spectrum of our different types of users. So from top to bottom, you can see that we're trying to design for users who kind of engage with different senses. So when they lack that ability to have touch, or they have a hard time seeing or hearing or speaking, and then even so, there's such a spectrum to the type of prominence that our users may face. So is this a permanent situational issue that our customer faces, or is it just situational? So someone who has a permanently only has one arm versus a mom who's holding a baby and only has one arm, how do they handle and work with your different products as they use them? So this is something that I'll dive into a little bit more later on, is talking about the different senses and how do you design for them. And one of the biggest questions that I get asked, or that it's quite a common question within the accessibility community, is, as a designer, how do I bring my team on board? And to be honest, it's a real challenge that we face day to day, because design, accessibility can start with design, but if it's only one tier of, our product design that is down for accessibility, it's not super helpful in the broader picture. So what can we do as designers to get our team on board? And like I said earlier, accessibility starts with understanding what it actually is. So in order for your team to understand, there's definitely an educational portion to having them grasp the concept of what accessibility is. So, and I truly stand by the fact that you need to understand it before you design or build for it. So that means that the team needs to have team alignment and one vision on what accessibility means, so that you guys can truly build for that one vision. Another example that also relates to that educational piece is show examples of why accessibility is important. And that means showing examples of what, a very good accessible product looks like versus something that, isn't so great. And I think that allows your team to kind of see hands-on how an accessible product can benefit not just a specific user group, but potentially even themselves. Even when it comes to showing examples, I also find that usability testing accessibility features is also quite an eye-opener for your team to kind of see how different types of users navigate through an experience, like specifically your product, and how accessible solutions can better help them. So when you kind of see the before and after, I think that in itself is quite an eye-opener to any team or any individual on why accessibility is so important. And the last one, it's having your team understand that accessibility is a team effort. And as as designers, a lot of the times we think that it's quite a front end thing, but it's actually the accessibility engineering is such a crucial part in painting the whole picture for a great accessible product. So some things that we've done with our team is actually just building work sessions with our engineers on defining what accessibility is, what are things that we need to look for as we build. So defining what a checklist for, what is it that we want to capture when it comes to accessibility, and building that criteria into your team's definition of done to ensure that accessibility is always captured as you guys build day to day. So that's also another really important thing that, we've tried to integrate in our team that has worked really well to make sure that we have accessibility built into our day to day. So this next section kind of talks about building creative confidence. So how do you, as a designer, take your knowledge in design and ensure that you're building an accessible product? And one thing to keep note of is that there are, and I find personally that there's quite a limited number of resources to kind of talk about accessibility and how it relates specifically to user experience in UI design. So how do I build my knowledge as a designer to make sure that I build design decisions that I think are accessible? And this is my process and my way of designing, so I just kind of want to share that with the team today. And to start off, like I said earlier, accessibility does start with design, because we, in fact, we build that foundation in our design to build accessible product, which then, then gets built into engineering. So with that, we also need to consider that our engineers are designer too. And as designers, we kind of build that front end portion, but there's such a rich experience when it comes to engineering and coding to ensure that our back-end systems kind of are usable for our customers who, for example, use functionality like Voiceover. So that means something like ensuring that our code is very, very clean, or that our tags are very, very clear to our customers who use the Voiceover functionality. And I would say script writing, and I'm going to dive into that a little bit later for those of you who don't know what that is critical. So as a user who doesn't have sight and navigates through a product through Voiceover, we need to ensure that all of the labels and all of the instructions are very, very clearly defined in the Voiceover script. And as much as, we designers want to be involved in that, there's sometimes we miss things. So we want to ensure that our engineers have the knowledge to kind of fill in those gaps when we can't. So that's kind of why I see accessibility as very, very much so being a designer-engineer relationship to kind of solve problems together. So like I said, this is probably the key question that really wanted me to share this presentation, is how do I, as a designer, build creative confidence to trust that I'm making accessible decisions? How do we know that we're meeting standards? Who tells me yes, something is accessible, or who tells me no, it's not? No one could probably tell you. There are some things when it comes to accessible design that is a lot clearer and definitive, but there's a lot of decision making that we do as designers day to day that no one has an answer for us. So how do we ensure that we're continuously pushing our accessibility standards? And I'm going to talk about that in this section here. And it's learning to build our accessibility logic is what I'm trying to say. So like I said, accessibility isn't always black and white. And I think there are some components of it that are, like we know that there are color contrast ratios that, are very, very specific, that there are font size limitations that we should follow. And there are rules when it comes to labeling, for example, that are very, very clear to us. But beyond those types of things, how do we ensure that, we're pushing the boundaries of accessibility? And one thing that I found works really well for my team at least, is building guiding principles that are most relevant to your product when it comes to accessibility. So I kind of mentioned earlier about the designer and engineering relationship, but this is kind of where you can get, the more holistic team involved, even like you can get product involved, you can get your engineers involved, get your data analytics, data team involved, and even more so, how do you get leadership involved in accessibility? And I always believe that guiding principles can be the backbone to your accessibility decisions day to day, and refer back to them very, very often to make sure that you're kind of meeting that criteria that the team has set for themselves. And I'm just going to share some of the guiding principles that our team has set out to kind of help you understand what kind of principles have been helpful for us. So we're very fortunate at Digital Factory to have a design system. So we've been able to use that design system as a baseline. So one of the guiding principles is use that design system as the baseline to all of your design. And what's really cool about that is we're ensuring that we're building in accessibility standards in all of the components and patterns that we use in all of our experiences. So you can imagine if we have one library of components, that means all of our various designers who are sharing these components are at least using accessible UI as the baseline. So I understand that not all teams have that flexibility of building in a design system, but even at a smaller scale, it's very possible to kind of ensure that at a smaller team level that you guys are using and sharing accessible components and patterns. This second principle here is very guided around copywriting and how users consume information and language. So thinking about communicating relevant information only when and where it's needed. And this really helps our customers, our day-to-day customers who face issues with cognitive load. We want our experiences to be really easy, digestible, and consumable for our customers. So let's just show them relevant information when and where it's needed. A second one, this is probably a super, super obvious UX principle, but that principle for us is literally just to be obvious. So design with clarity and simplicity and transparency to remove points of friction. I think sometimes we forget that simple experiences aids accessibility in every way possible. So that's something that our team needs to be super mindful of when they make design decisions. In this next section, I called it Beyond the Baseline, and it's talking about how do we take, foundational components of accessibility that we can easily find in, our WCAG guidelines and truly push that. So for those of you who don't know, WCAG is a web standard guideline for accessibility. Yes, it's specific to web, but I think a lot of the principles itself could be applied to mobile as well if you design in that space. So one thing I did was I actually looked through and did an audit on the most recent version of WCAG to kind of see what is actually covered in the guidelines. And it covers very basic things like color contrast, function patterns, and content grouping. But in design, I think it's very clear to us that we do so much more than that. And there's quite a lot of topics that aren't covered. And so some things that I've made a note of that isn't thoroughly covered in the guideline are things like layout or UX copywriting. How do we work with gestures and animations when it comes to accessibility? Thinking about sounds, haptic, and voice, or even information architecture is huge when it comes to aiding customers through an experience, and thinking about scalability. So I actually took some time to actually take some of these key topics, and I'm going to actually walk you guys through how I kind of manage my process when it comes to some of these different topics there. So another audit I did was I actually looked online to kind of see what resources are out there available for designers who are more focused in the user experience and UI space. And I found a lot of the examples to be very, very similar amongst all of the various resources, which is why I think for designers it's very challenging for us to kind of grasp the idea of pushing accessibility if we don't have the resources to kind of help us get there. And you'll note these are very, very common examples that we find day to day. So like adding enough color contrast, don't use color alone. Or design usable focus states, or use labels or instructions with form fields. Those are things that should be very, very obvious to us. And yes, if we follow those 4 or 6 basic accessibility rules, our product could be accessible. But to me, that's just baseline accessibility, right? So beyond the WCAG standards, how do we design product that is even more accessible? And so the challenge for my team isn't thinking about, how do we meet the standards? It's how do we really push and elevate what we do to ensure we have best in class accessible design in what we build. So to kind of sum up the sections earlier, I think one thing to note is we want to think about these 4 key pillars when we design our experiences. And that's the vision experience. So how does someone look at shape, color, contrast, size, text in your interfaces? I think that one's quite commonly covered in the WCAG. In that second column, thinking about the hearing experience. So how do our customers consume sound in our product? And what does that experience look like? And later in my presentation, I'm going to talk about how sound and haptics is an additional layer of communication that we should think about. In the third column there, the thinking experience. So how do our customers consume, and how much attention do they need to pay into into what they're consuming on a page. And the last one is reach and dexterity experience. So this is considering, users, how do they move and navigate within and interact within our product. Baseline things that we should think about in every single type of flow that we create. And I think this is actually where I cut off in our last webinar. So hopefully all this content moving forward is going to be new to a lot of you guys. So what I'm actually going to do in the second half of the presentation is actually walk you guys through a lot of the basic principles that I think about when I build, and how do I embed that into my day-to-day decision making. Flip through that too quickly. So UX copywriting, I believe, is a really, really big principle that we need to think about when it comes to aiding customers in accessibility. And that some key principles when it comes to UX copywriting is making sure that our content is very clear and informative, that we set our users' expectation with the copy that we write, and that we're very, very consistent throughout. A lot of our customers, they understand copy, and that allows them to navigate throughout. So if you're going to be using the next button, there shouldn't be a continue button, because customers will get adapted to that pattern of, the term next to proceed. And we also, for us designing Canadian products, we need to make sure that our design can easily be localized and scaled to French. And another thing that I should note here is for our products that, that support dynamic font scaling, we need to ensure that our layouts, are adaptive to that as well. So I'm actually going to walk you guys through an example of a settings menu that I just quickly mocked up here of something that is decently accessible. How do we push that even further with the example on the right? So you can see the example on the right is more clear and informative, and it sets users' expectations. But how? So one thing I want to highlight, and you'll notice in the pink bubble there, you'll notice that the icon is highlighted. And so one thing that I found when it comes to design is that icons aren't always scalable. And the reason why is that you can imagine when you start scaling your settings menu to, let's say, 10 or 12 items, the icons don't mean much at that point, especially when some of your setting items are abstract and there isn't necessarily an icon that can be associated with it. It becomes really challenging for some users to digest what those icons even mean. So let's just strip them away so that it's just clear to our customer that it is just profile information, or that it's just notifications. And also for our, as we build our accessibility script, including those icons are just an additional component that the voiceover needs to read out that isn't necessarily helpful to our customers to help them navigate through our experiences. And to the second point, you'll also notice that think about the potential concept of being able to add descriptions to, in this context, it's just settings. So this sets our users' expectations so that they understand what they're about to click into. So you can see under profile information, it's letting our users know upfront that this allows them the ability to view and update their personal contact information. And this isn't where you would go in to update your credit card information, for example. So it's being very clear to our customers and setting that expectation upfront. In the example of the notifications, it's letting them know that they can manage their notifications specifically set to their email. So you can imagine for a customer who didn't even know that there were email notifications, we're letting them know that information upfront. But one thing you'll also notice here is that we compromise space. And I think this is really important for designers and your team to really understand and get aligned on whether that's something that you want to do in your experience. Is the compromisation of space worth it in this scenario? And it also, one thing to think about is does it work for your product? So in my situation, we're designing, let's say you're designing a new product. In that instance, descriptions can be very, very helpful for your customers. But in an instance where your product has been available for many, many years and a lot of your setting menus are very, very straightforward, in that situation, then maybe the descriptions aren't necessary. So it's thinking about your product and what could be most helpful for your customers. And another process that I take when I design to ensure that I've really pushed the boundaries of accessibility is actually through putting a checklist together. And for me, that helps me understand beyond baseline accessibility, what else have I done to ensure that my experience is accessible? So I'm going to walk you guys through what makes this setting menu accessible. So I have very clear hierarchy and headlines, so you'll see a differentiation between the both. My font sizes meet the font size criteria when it comes to WCAG, but I've also pushed it by enlarging some of the font sizes. I've made sure that all of the clickable components in the text on the page meets color contrast. I've ensured that my tappable area meets the 44 by 44 minimum tappable area, and I've pushed that by making sure that the cells are a lot larger and they're 68 pixels. I make sure that I have a obvious clickable visual indicator so our customers understand that this is a clickable component, and that's indicated by the chevron. I've set user expectation by providing the description and providing context as to what the user can expect. And I've made sure that this design is scalable. So if the user, so in design, if we were to scale the settings menu to French, the design wouldn't break at all. So those are some things that I kind of think about as I build, and thinking about defining a checklist has been really helpful in doing that for me. So another key thing that I want to talk about is voiceover and talkback. I'm sure some of you guys know what it is, but I do talk about it in my presentation. So I previously talked about it, and I will talk about it a little bit more. So I kind of want to talk about what that actually is. So for those of you who don't know, it's a built-in gesture-based feature native to our OSs that speaks what is written and viewed on your device. So for our customers who have hard of seeing, a lot of our customers, or a lot of people, use this functionality. And it's really, really important when it comes to UX copywriting, because the scripts that we write with our developers is really, really important. So I actually want to show you guys an example of how VoiceOver works. So you guys kind of understand the importance of language when it comes to our customers who use this functionality. So all I do here is I'm just trying to turn on and off VoiceOver. So I'm just going to walk you guys through a little clip so you guys can see how it works.
Voiceover, tap, double tap to app, swipe 3, voice, speaking, 40%, speak, verbose, braille, verb, speech, speak 50%, speaking, voiceover, swipe 3, double, tap 1, voiceover off.
So hopefully you guys were able to hear that. So you can see, as a user who has low vision or someone who can't see at all, they have to navigate through our products by swiping through the various components and cells on a page. So if our documentation of script writing isn't clear, it's not clear to those customers what it is that they're looking at, or what it is that they have to do to, in this case, turn off VoiceOver. And you also can see that I had a lot of issues trying to navigate throughout the app. And for a customer who has hard of seeing, it's really challenging for them to understand what is going on the page. So the script writing is super, super critical as designers when we think about the UX copywriting portion. We want to make sure that we're very clear, descriptive, but not too descriptive where it gets confusing to our customer what it is that they need to do to, let's say, turn off VoiceOver. So specifically here, I'm going to talk a little bit about the script writing. Is for VoiceOver accessibility script, you'll see the X icon in the profile info on the top right navigation. So for a customer who can easily see, it's a very, very universal icon for us to understand that that X means to close. So we would think that in the accessibility script, we just indicate that that close is a button, and the script would just read out close, which is fine, but how do we push and elevate this experience even more to set context for our customers to understand what that close actually does? So you can choose to put close, but to push that even further, let's actually indicate to our customer that this button, by pressing that, you will return back to the settings menu. So as designers, we do have that ability and flexibility to work with our developers to tweak the script beyond what is seen on the screen. So for your day-to-day customer who can see that, it's just a close. But in our voiceover script, let's be very, very descriptive to have our customers understand that by pressing this close, you're going to return back to the settings menu. So back to our principles, it's very clear and informative, and we're setting the right user expectation when it comes to script writing. Another principle that I want to highlight is thinking about your layouts, your information architecture, and navigation when you build. So some key principles around that is allowing our users to easily access information and content, allow another way of navigating, think about intentional placement, and the scannability of your content. So this might seem very obvious to some of us, but it's something that I found has been very, very helpful for our team here is prioritize and document your content and your IA from the most important to the least important. Seems very straightforward, but one thing that I found is when you document it and actually list it out, you can then make sure that you are building your architecture and your layouts in a way that is actually reflective and helpful for customers to navigate. And if you're having challenges trying to understand what is actually most important to least important, for those of you who actually have analytics tagged into your various components, use it as a guideline to see what is most clicked in your experience to help you with that prioritization. And why prioritization is very important, because at a foundational level, it could help you determine the appropriate navigation type for your product. So something like a hamburger menu, in some instances, we want that to be intentional. We want our menu items to be a little bit hidden. But when it comes to accessibility design, we want to be very obvious in our experience. And that's why sometimes that bottom fixed navigation is a very, very helpful design decision when it comes to thinking about accessibility. Again, I'm sure a lot of you guys have seen this, but we also have to think about thumb zone and where can our customers easily reach and navigate within our experiences. So you can see with the illustration on the bottom right that the most natural and easiest way for our customers to navigate is within the bottom 3/4 of the page. So for our customers who have issues with dexterity and want to be able to, just use their thumb to navigate, we want to ensure that our clickable components are easy to navigate to. And that means thinking about, should I allocate buttons to closer to the bottom of the page, or should they be at the top? It's a little bit more challenging for our customers to navigate at the top. So think about the options to kind of push your, have more intentional placement with where you put your buttons, for example. And if you always put buttons at that bottom of the page, customers will also start to build that pattern and understanding that they can find buttons at the bottom of the page. So this allows our customers to easily access information. It's very intentional placement to put more content towards the bottom of the page versus the top, and it allows our customers to easily scan information a lot easier. And we also want to be ensure that if you do make that design decision to put clickable components closer to the bottom of the page, you want to be consistent with that throughout, so that customers kind of build that natural ability to find things at the bottom of the page. And so I want to show how I took a very common looking bottom navigation and pushed it to be more accessible. And that example on the top, I wanted to specifically highlight because it's similar to what you'll find in our Facebook and Instagram experiences today. So how do we take something that looks like that and elevate it a little bit more? So one thing we need to be mindful of is allowing customers to see that something has changed. So thinking about state changes. So if a customer is to tap or to hover over a certain button, we need to clearly visualize that. So what I've done here is, in our non-clickable, our non-active buttons, you can see that they're just stroke outlines. They're not filled. But in a scenario where a customer has clicked on it, it clearly visually indicates that they are on the Get Care button, and they can clearly see that by the line that's indicated on top, and by the fact that it's green, and by the fact that the icon went from something that was just a stroke to something that's now filled. So the differentiation as state change is what allows our customers to easily understand that they're currently on that page and that they navigated from one page to another. And why we need to be really clear with that is for customers who, who are non-sighted, or who have cognitive issues, it's very clear to them that they are navigated to that specific page. And another thing from the top example to the bottom example is we want to be very clear with our experiences. So we want to be clear with our navigation. So including labels, like my settings menu earlier, is descriptions are very, very helpful in setting expectations for our customers. So it's very clear that the home icon means home. And the last icon, in an instance where I didn't have a description, could that mean profile and settings? Could it mean just profile? In this instance, it actually means being able to view your caregivers. So we want to ensure that our labels are very, very clear to set that expectation for our customers. So again, to kind of reiterate to myself what makes this component accessible, I've made sure that I met the color contrast ratios. I've ensured that my tappable areas, exceed the minimum. I have clear and distinguishable click states. I set my user's expectation with context through labels in this instance. I've considered the range of motion for our customers because the bottom navigation is easier for them to reach. And again, through a fixed navigation, it allows them to easily access the navigation at any point in the experience. So that was my checklist to ensure that this component meets accessibility standards. Another thing to think about is consider alternative ways of showing content that's more scannable and accessible. So that means your solution may not be accessible right now, but consider allowing customers another way to navigate. So if your primary solution doesn't meet all needs, think about building a secondary option. So I'm actually going to show an example. So my process to ensuring that my product is accessible is I want to create some scenarios to make sure that I can meet different accessible scenarios. Define what the issues are, specify what your challenge is that you're trying to create, and explain what your solutions are. So this is my approach, and I'm going to kind of walk you guys through how I navigate through this process as I build. So I took Instagram as an example here, and I kind of want to address a specific challenge to myself. So in this scenario, the user has 35 active stories, articles, or actions. So in this example, I'm just using Instagram, but you can imagine in the feed section of Instagram, it could really be actions or it could be articles on a news product. In this scenario as well, the user has limited available thumb reach. So I'm just making up scenarios to ensure that I've captured it as we build. And my user actively uses Voiceover and wants to navigate to post 1. And by post 1, I mean that one where you see the data doesn't lie. How does a user navigate there if we currently have 35 active stories? So to define what the issue is here, there's too many active stories at once. The user must click through 35 stories to get to post number 1. And the swipe gesture that Instagram includes is too high on the page for this specific user to reach. So the thumb reach and the dexterity is a little bit lower. How does the customer navigate up there? So the challenge that I want to surface for myself here is how can we allow all users to easily scan all available stories in a single view? So in one way is by offering another way of navigating. So how did I kind of solve for that? So and these are just examples, these are just ideas, and it doesn't mean that they're right, but the mindset that we're trying to understand is how do we push an experience to make it more accessible? And in this scenario, it's by providing another way of navigating. So if you're looking at the page on the design on the left, it's by offering a list view. So if the user can click on the list view, it provides them all of the stories in a single viewport, allowing the customer to easily see where they want to access to. So if I wanted to navigate to Food Network, I know Food Network is an available story without having to swipe to get there. I can see it all in a single view. So what did we solve? The user has the choice to view all stories in one single view. But what this doesn't solve is the user still has to swipe past 35 stories to get to the first post. So how do we push this even further? Solution number 2. And I thought about the ability, what if the user is able to view 10 stories at a time and there's a view all button that allows them to view the rest of the 25? So what did we solve by doing a view all button? The user can only view a limited number of stories, which is 10 in this scenario, before they can view the rest. So in what we've solved here is the user only needs to swipe 10 times instead of 35 times to get to the first post. Oops. So to get back to that, one thing that I want to kind of highlight is that we were able to solve a specific scenario here, but one thing that the team needs to kind of take away is this the best user experience for your product? So we were able to solve it for accessibility and for the general use for our customers to be able to navigate to post one, but that means that the users have an additional click to view all stories. What I'm trying to explain here is to kind of think about the process on how you navigate and push your design accessibility concepts, not necessarily that this is the right solution, but thinking about how do we elevate and get the team involved to solve these specific issues. So the next principle that I want to get into is thinking about interaction patterns. And some of the key principles that kind of relate to that is how do we help users get from point A to point B? How do we provide feedback to help our users be in the loop with what's actually happening in the UI front? How do we start leveraging existing UX patterns that already work? And some two principles that are, have come up quite often is how do we set our users' expectation and how do we be very obvious with the designs that we show? So according to WCAG, disabled buttons do not need to meet accessibility standards. And I have a little blurb there that, I pulled from WCAG. But to me, I believe that they do. So I'm going to show an example here. And to preface this for anyone who is an RVC customer here or works at RVC, I am an RVC customer. And so what I was doing was trying to find a scenario of where disabled buttons are in an experience and how do we kind of push and elevate that a little bit more. So defining the scenario here with the disabled button is, in this scenario, the user has a password with just 8 characters. The user inputs the incorrect password with just 7 characters. So what is the issue that we're trying to solve here? So defining some of those issues, the user has not met the minimum requirement. The user input the incorrect password. The user cannot press sign in disabled button. The disabled button doesn't meet accessible requirements. Voiceover doesn't actually read disabled state, so that's something critical to think about. And the user doesn't receive feedback on the issue. And why I wanted to show and highlight this experience is actually because this is something that we're trying to solve within our app right now. So I can show our app, but we actually have disabled buttons in our product right now. So it was really critical for me to do this evaluation, and I wanted to share it so that I can kind of walk you guys through the thinking of that. So we've defined the issues, and our challenge is how can we allow users to sign in with active feedback? So in this scenario right now, the user can't click the disabled button to receive feedback on what they can do to fix whatever the issue is. So in our experience right now, the user can't click sign in. So what can we do to help them? So what can we solve? And I believe that including active state buttons, so the example you see on the right, allows the users to get active feedback. So if the user hasn't met the criteria, they're not able to sign in. But even though they're not able to sign in, if we include an active button, that allows us to show the users feedback. So in this case, the user hasn't met the correct criteria. So they understand now that I need to look at my username and password and put that in again to make sure that it meets the requirements. But the user doesn't get that in-context feedback if there's nothing to click on. So what do we solve by putting in an active button? It allows the user to have the ability to submit any input to receive in-context feedback. So let's say in an instance where you're trying to send money and it's a required field that you need to input an amount you want to transfer, if we don't allow our customer to submit, they wouldn't know that they need to input an amount to transfer. So the critical part about an active state button is it provides feedback to our customers. But Sometimes disabled states do work really well. And so in a scenario where disabled buttons work for your specific flow, how do we take a disabled button and make it accessible? So you kind of have to do the evaluation on whether it makes sense or not within your experience. Sometimes it can aid, but sometimes it can truly make a customer stuck in an experience. So I just created a button here, and you can see that the button on the top is one that's not accessible, but how do we take that and make it more accessible to the solution you see on the bottom? So first things first, it's very obvious to us that, hey, it doesn't meet color contrast, so let's make sure that that sign-in text meets our color contrast ratios. So that's what you see in the second example, right in the middle. But one thing you'll notice is that sign-in text looks exactly like any body copy on a page. So it's not clearly indicated to customer that this is a button. So for our customers who have maybe hard time seeing, they wouldn't be able to notice the difference between a button and their body copy. So what can we do to push that even further? So quite a simple solution. You can see that in the bottom example that's highlighted in pink, the outline of a button is the visual indicator that allows customers to know that something is a button. So all we need to do is create an outline on the button and ensure that that meets color contrast. So someone who may have challenges seeing color contrast ratios can now see that this is the button because of the shape of the button, but also that the content within it clearly indicates that it's a button. So what makes this specific design more accessible than the original? We've ensured that we've met the color contrast ratios. We've elevated the tappable area to make sure that it's at least 44 by 44. So in this case, it's 48 by 339. We have clear and distinguishable patterns. So when you actually put the disabled state in the context of all your various buttons, does it still look like a disabled button? In this case, yeah, it does. And in the last point, it's setting the user's expectation with clear context. And again, that's just with it indicating with a very clear label that in this scenario, the customer can sign in. And to our last topic that I want to cover, I'm just going to quickly highlight this one. And it's more of a takeaway is how do we start building sound and haptics as layers of communication? So as designers, we kind of think about the surface level UI and the visual design layer of communication. How do we start building on top of that and think about sound and haptics? How do we humanize our experiences through our other senses through things like sound and touch? And how do we send feedback to keep our users informed through these other layers of communication? So one thing I wanted to kind of mention here is as we grow our digital experiences, we kind of lose that human touch. So a lot of our products that we build are becoming a lot more self-serve. So how do we elevate our products to feel more humanized? And how do we communicate to our customers beyond the UI and the UX interface? And so I'm actually gonna walk you guys through an example. And I'm gonna use Slack in this case as an example. So we wanna notify our customers that they got a message. How do we do that for users who have different needs? So again, back to this Microsoft example, I'm gonna highlight Alex, the bartender. So he can't hear as a bartender because it's really loud where he works. And this is a situational circumstance that Alex is in. So Alex receives a notification on his device. How does Alex get notified that, in this case, Sophie sent him a message? So he can't hear through sound because his environment's really loud, and he can't see because he has, let's say, his phone in his pocket. But Alex gets notified through that layer of touch. The phone vibrates, and that's how Alex realized that he got a message on Slack. So you can see how the layers of communication allowed Alex to get notified. So in another scenario here that I'm gonna highlight, there's a mom, she's a new parent, she's holding her baby in one hand, and she doesn't have the necessary ability to touch. So she's in a situational circumstance. So how does she get notified? So in this example, Christy gets a message on Slack on her desktop. How does she realize that she got a message? So she has a baby in one hand, she's not necessarily on and actively looking at her computer. So she can't see that she got notified through the visual notification indicators. She can't touch because there's no touch on her desktop, but she can hear. And that's that layer through sound. So she couldn't necessarily see or touch, but she could hear that she got a notification. So that's different than the previous example. And the last example, someone who has a temporary, in this case, this person has laryngitis, they can't necessarily speak. How does this person receive notifications? So in this scenario, it's a Slack notification on a device. How does Chris get notified? So even though he can't speak, he can hear. So he heard the notification. He felt the notification on the app, but he can also see the notification. So you can see how the different layers of communication kind of serve a broader range of audience when it comes to receiving feedback. And so I'm not going to dive into this too much, but I just the thing I want to leave you guys with is this question, is where can we meaningfully integrate sound and haptic to enhance communication within our products? And I think when it comes to notifications, that's a very, very obvious example, but think about how do we notify our customers of something that was successful or something that wasn't successful through sound and haptics. So that would probably be my key takeaway when it comes to thinking about something like this. And that pretty much sums up the presentation. And I'll leave you guys here with some key takeaways to sum up kind of what I've mentioned throughout. So build your mentality, design for all users, not just your target group. Design for people with various abilities, contexts, and situations. And I would say that situations is probably the one that I would highlight the most. Bring your team on board through education and examples. Develop principles of accessibility that serve as your foundation to building an inclusive product. Set users' expectations and be obvious. And build richer experiences through visuals, sound, and touch. And that's it for me.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Julie. That was really informative. Thank you so much. While you turn off the screen share. And yeah, so I think now we don't have a lot of time, but we do have some time to take a few questions if there are any doubts or any specific things that people are struggling with, especially when it comes to accessibility. Will you be sharing the slides, Julie?
I will be.
Okay.
I'll share that with you,
Yeah.
and share to the board.
For sure. Thank you. Any other questions? Okay, my question, trying to figure out. So, Radley, I'm gonna unmute you. So why don't you ask the question?
Oh, hey, can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Hey. Okay.
Can't hear you.
Thanks for that. You can't hear me?
Now we can.
Awesome. Julie, thanks for that. That was awesome. My question for you is, so I'm starting a new project and we're in wireframing mode, trying to get everything, ready for design and dev. But accessibility came up and we need a way of documenting this, not only for our internal team, but for stakeholders as well. And we need to share this out. So what's the best way that your team has come up with for creating a repository for this information and kind of sharing that to a bigger team as a whole?
How do I speak?
Okay.
Oh, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, you guys can hear me. Perfect. So I actually have a question. So is it ensuring that you guys want to share your team's principles of accessibility to a broader audience, or do you want to share your accessibility requirements for a specific design? Oh, I can't hear.
Oh, sorry, I couldn't unmute myself, but now I can. No, it's for specific design. So if we're doing wireframing, we have specific screens and then the requirements for each screen. So we want to make sure that there's visibility from the dev team, but also the POs and then the POs stakeholders.
Right. So I can only speak on behalf of the experience that I have here at Scotiabank. So we use a tool called Confluence, and that's where it's open to everybody within the bank. And that means through our design section of the Confluence page for my specific team, we highlight a section on accessibility so that that kind of outlines what are our accessibility guidelines. But when it comes to particular flows, I actually have a column specific for accessibility. So you show your design, you show the description of what that design is, and I have a specific column that outlines what it is that, what considerations design and engineers need to think about when it comes to accessibility. So it depends on your team, but in my specific scenario that I can speak to, we do have a shareable documentation tool like Confluence that is open to the broader bank, so everybody can see it. So I guess the most important thing, to take away is you should have a dedicated accessibility column or section, so the broader teams can see the importance of accessibility and how it can aid your customers when you build out your design solutions. Make it part of your documentation. I hope that was helpful.
Okay. Hope that helps, Radley. Okay, so do we have any other questions? So if not, we can definitely also carry forward the conversation in the DesignX, the Slack group. We'll definitely get back with sharing the slides and everything in the follow-up email, and hopefully also a video recording of the webinar if it all came through well. One last request I have is for the email that we will be sending out and for the video, I would love to take a webinar selfie. So if everyone can switch on the cameras, I'm going to take a quick screenshot of the screen so we can get everyone in. Oh yeah, already see a few faces. Awesome. There should be a term for webinar selfies. Webby-fees? I don't know. Slowly. Just need a few more to get the grid going. See some familiar faces like Danielle and Bilge from the DesignX team. That's amazing. 5 more to make the grid complete. Or we can Photoshop it also, always. 2 more. 2 more. 1 more. 1 to go. Okay, we got a full grid. Woo! Awesome. Okay, great. So thank you so much, folks. Thank you so much, Julie.
Thank you.
There. And yeah, hopefully we'll continue to have more webinars coming your way. And if some of you or many of you are coming to the Design Leadership Summit next Saturday, we'll see you there. Awesome. Have a good one. Bye.